Chapter 6. As soon as they'd carried the supplies in, Heather punched down the bread, leaving it to rise once more. It was only 10:30, so hopefully, they could have the bread baked and sandwiches made before Patrick came home for lunch. Do we need to have something else ready in case the bread doesn't rise fast enough? Heather asked. She knew that Patrick had a hunger that surpassed anything she'd ever seen, but she didn't know if he got angry when he was hungry. With as large as Patrick was, she didn't ever want to see him angry. Sally shook her head. If it's not ready in time, I'll fry up a dozen eggs, and he can have eggs and bacon for lunch. He's not fussy about what he eats, as long as there's a lot of it. Heather nodded, happy to hear her husband wasn't a picky eater. Do we have anything that needs to be picked from the garden today? Nothing at all. We did all that yesterday. We could use some huckleberries, but they're only in the higher altitudes. Heather looked out a window, pointing to one of the mountains towering over them. Like that? She asked. Exactly. Maybe I can get you and Patrick to try to find some for me. Though, I'll warn you now. Picking huckleberries is a very slow thing. The berries are tiny, and to get enough to make a pie, you must spend hours picking the berries. Patrick said we should go for a walk tonight and pick berries. Sally clapped happily. Oh, a romantic walk at sunset. It's just what you both need to be in a baby-making mood. We'll pack you a nice picnic supper. Make sure Patrick carries it though. It would be much too heavy for someone like you. Heather laughed, unsure if the older woman was joking or not. Either way, she'd be happy to have a picnic supper with her new husband. The bread had just come out of the oven when Patrick arrived at the house for his lunch. Heather picked up a kitchen towel so she wouldn't hurt her hand holding the bread in place, and then she quickly cut the bread into slices. She cut up 3 full loaves, and then she buttered each piece of bread. They carried the buttered bread into the dining room on one plate and the bacon on the other. As they sat down, Patrick smiled. Did you two get your shopping done? We did, Sally said. And we made bread for sandwiches before you got here. So now we'll have bacon sandwiches. Patrick nodded, and they all bowed their heads for their prayer of thanksgiving for the meal. Heather couldn't believe how truly happy she was in this new place, with her new husband and mother-in-law. She was still nervous about consummating their marriage, but she knew it wouldn't be too terribly bad. Not with as gentle as Patrick had been with her. What all did you get at the store? Patrick asked, knowing his mother would talk through the rest of the meal, and he wouldn't have to think about conversation. Sally listed everything they'd purchased. Oh, and Heather got some fabric for curtains for your room. She thought it would be nice to have them. Patrick nodded. That sounds good. He ate quickly and was gone again. They did the lunch dishes, and after lunch, Heather measured the windows in their room and cut the fabric, immediately starting to hem it. Sally called her into the parlor, where Heather hadn't yet spent any time, and Heather joined her with her project in her hands. What are you making? She asked her mother-in-law. I'm making booties for my grandbabies. I think they'll each need their own pair, so I'm making an even dozen. Doesn't that sound nice? Heather just smiled and nodded. She wasn't going to talk about imaginary babies all day every day. She wanted children, and she'd be happy when the time came, but she wasn't going to obsess over them the way her mother-in-law did. They decided on more sandwiches for supper that night, as Patrick and Heather were taking the food for their picnic. It would just be easier. And I'm making my delicious potato salad to go with it. I'll try anything, Heather said, smiling. When Patrick came home, Heather was ready with 2 baskets filled with their supper and a bag to put their plates and forks in after they'd eaten. Aren't we going to eat first? Patrick said when she picked up the baskets. We packed a picnic, Heather said, hoping it would please him. Picnics are good. Patrick opened the door for her, and the two of them stood for a moment on the porch. There's a good spot for huckleberry picking at the top of that hill. He pointed to the east. So, we're climbing a hill. All right. Heather had wanted to try her hand at climbing, and she was excited they could try it that day. Of course, she hoped that her lungs wouldn't explode as they tried to adjust to an even higher altitude. Patrick took the baskets from her hands, and they walked along together. At the base of the hill, he looked at her. Perfect place to picnic. She smiled and nodded. Sounds wonderful. She spread the blanket that she had in the bag out on the ground, and when he'd put down the baskets, she pulled out 2 plates, the potato salad which was held in 2 mason jars, and the 12 sandwiches she and Sally had packed. Filling both plates, she handed him a fork. Maybe tomorrow night, we'll have huckleberry pie for dessert. I'd like that a lot. Do you enjoy cooking? He asked. She nodded. I love to cook. After the prayer, he said, You've learned a lot about me in the past 2 days. Tell me something about you. Did you live with your parents back east? She thought for a moment about not telling him anything, but she decided it was best to be truthful. My father passed away years ago, but I lived with my mother. She pretended to be ill, to keep me as a prisoner, doing all the chores while she laid in bed. After I confirmed with her doctor that she was truly not sick, I sent you a telegram the following day. I had no desire to remain there as her captive. He looked at her for a moment. Do you feel like you did the right thing? I know I did. She was just starting to tell me she only had a month or 2 left so that I'd read to her for several hours every day as well as doing all the chores. I know I must sound like a terrible daughter, but I decided to sneak out one morning before she woke. I did leave a note, but I didn't tell her where I was going. Heather looked down at her hands for a moment and then looked at his face, trying to see if he thought she was a bad person for the way she'd left Beckham. I see. I can't be upset with you for it because it brought you here to me. I would rather not tell your mother if you don't mind. Patrick shook his head. Oh, I wouldn't tell anyone. It's your story if you ever want to share it. After their meal, they climbed the hill, and she was out of breath and panting badly before they reached the top. I'm not used to this altitude yet, she explained as she got her breath back. I should have thought of that, he said. I've never really left our valley, though, so I haven't experienced it. I've heard others talk about it. He waited patiently as she got her breathing under control and then pointed. Those are huckleberries. I always just sit down in the grass and pick them. It's so much easier than constantly bending. You have much further to bend than I do, she said with a grin. That is very true. An hour later, they'd each picked half a basket of the berries. What do you think of huckleberry picking? Patrick asked. It takes forever. Heather said, shaking her head. And I tried a couple. They're very sour. They are. Ma usually adds lots of sugar, or she mixes them with a less sour kind of berry when she makes pies. I can see why. Looking into her basket, she was shocked at how few she really had after an hour's work. I may not be doing a lot of huckleberry picking. He grinned. Just wait until you taste your first huckleberry pie. They're so good, they make you cry. Walking down the hill was easier than climbing it, though the hill was steep enough it made her nervous to head down it. Once they reached the bottom, he dumped all the berries into one basket. She frowned at him. Why'd you do that? Because then we can put the empty basket into that bag of yours, and I can hold your hand as we walk toward the house. Your mother will just assume we're holding hands, because we tried to make a baby while picking berries. Patrick sighed, reaching for her hand. I'm sure she will. She needs to learn that she can think some things, but they shouldn't always come flying out of her mouth like some sort of demented bird. Heather giggled. Very true. She seems content to make baby close now. She's going to hate me if I am barren. Do you have any reason to believe you might be? He asked. He looked at her, a bit worried, because he wanted children. None at all, she replied. I just can't see her being all right with that. She wouldn't be. She'd start looking for orphan trains so we could have a family anyway. Are there orphan trains coming through here? She asked. She'd heard about orphan trains, but wasn't sure if they were real or not. It sounded like something fictitious to her. He nodded. There have been a few. Our valley is made up of people who have big hearts, and many take in orphans. And not to be farmhands either. They take them in to be their children. That sounds lovely. We could give your mother at least half of the grandchildren she wants in a single day. He laughed. I have a feeling grandchildren won't be a terrible problem. She blushed. I suppose we'll find out in time. Back at the house, they gave the berries to Sally, who immediately washed them. I'll show you how to make a perfect huckleberry pie tomorrow, she told Heather. I'm eager to learn, Heather said, though she still wasn't certain how anyone could make the sour berries taste good. Did you two enjoy your walk? Sally asked. Oh, it was nice. I loved the view from that hill. Heather said. I'm glad. I may send you both out again. Patrick frowned. We need to wait until Heather is breathing better. The change in altitude is bothering her. Oh, I hadn't realized. Sally looked at Heather. Sit. I don't want you overdoing it. Heather laughed. I'm fine. Although it's getting late. I'm going to turn in. I'll be up as soon as I milk the cow, Patrick said. Heather took a deep breath. She knew that this was the night they'd consummate their marriage. She couldn't claim to be too tired again because she'd gotten plenty of sleep the night before. Sally smiled at her. Good night. Good night, Sally. Climbing the stairs, Heather lost her breath again, but it wasn't hurting her chest nearly as much as climbing the hill had. It was odd that it was so hard to adjust to the new altitude. She quickly changed into her nightgown, but instead of lying down in bed, she picked up one of the books she'd brought with her. She only had a few, and she wasn't willing to leave any of them behind. She chose The Time Machine by H.G. Wells as her book for the evening. She'd already read it a dozen times, but it was so good, she knew she'd read it at least a dozen more. When Patrick joined her, he found her sitting up in bed, and was pleased he wouldn't have to wait longer. What are you reading? He asked as he pushed his suspenders down over his arms and unbuttoned his shirt. It's a science fiction novel by H.G. Wells. Have you read any of his work? I haven't. What's it called? The Time Machine. It's about a man who builds a time machine and travels into the future where men are divided into two species. I love it. I've read it many times. Perhaps you'll let me borrow it one day, he suggested. I'd be happy to. When you have time to read. He unfastened his pants then, and she closed her eyes tightly. She didn't want to see her husband naked. It would be unseemly. He chuckled when he saw her eyes close, walking to her side of the bed, and liberating the book from her hands. He then turned down the lantern on her nightstand and walked around the bed to climb into it beside her. You don't have to be afraid of this, Heather. She opened her eyes, making certain to keep them on his face and not let them roam. It was dark, but there was enough moonlight streaming in through the window that she could see more than she cared to. I'm not afraid, necessarily. Just nervous. It's a new experience, and I should be nervous about it. His big hands moved to her, pulling her toward him and kissing her softly at first, and then with rising passion. His hands roamed all over her body. When one reached down to cup her breast, she gasped in surprise. Are you allowed to touch me there? She asked in a whisper. I'm your husband. I'm allowed to touch you anywhere, Patrick whispered back. When he finally covered her body with his, she braced herself to be flattened like a pancake, But he caught himself on his forearms and didn't put his full weight on her body. After they'd become one, he rolled to his back, pulling her to him so he could play with her hair. "I think I want to do that again." "Not tonight, but maybe tomorrow," she said softly. It had been wonderful watching his face as he'd found his pleasure in her arms. He chuckled. "Trust me. It's happening again." Chapter 7. Church on Sunday was an exciting experience for Heather. It was amazing to be able to worship instead of staying home with her mother. She met so many of the people in town that their names were all a blur by the end of their time at the church. And while she enjoyed meeting all the people, she was ready to go home when it was time. There was just something about the house she shared with Sally and Patrick that made her smile. After their lunch, Patrick smiled at Heather. "Would you like to go for a drive and see the lake?" he asked. "I would love to. Should I change?" He shook his head. "No, we're not going in the lake, though many do swim there in bathing costumes. I just want to take you to see it. It's beautiful." "I'd like that a lot." Sally nodded. "Go. Young lovers should go and do things. I'll stay here, make supper, and sew for my future grandbabies." Patrick said nothing else, putting an arm around Heather and leading her out to the wagon, which he'd left the team hitched to while they ate. As soon as they were in the wagon and out of hearing distance of the house, he said, "Don't mind Ma. She's been lonely since Pa died, and she thinks it's our job to entertain her with grandchildren." Heather shook her head. "I'll live through it. At least she's up and doing things to make those babies have better lives when they do come." "You don't think your mother would?" "Not at all. She told me I couldn't talk about having children because I knew she wouldn't be there to see them." "Do you think you should write to her and let her know you're married and all right? It worries me that she must think you're dead somewhere." "I don't really want to, but I probably should. I'll write her a letter this evening, and I can walk it into town tomorrow." Patrick's eyes widened. "That would be a long walk." "From what I can tell, it's about the same distance I walked into Beckham back home, and I made that walk at least once a week." Heather shrugged. "I feel like I'm mostly accustomed to the altitude, so it should be too difficult. It's the altitude that concerns me. I hope you're going to do fine, but I worry you'll have trouble." "Would it make you feel better if I drive into town instead?" she asked. "It would. Take Ma. Go to the butcher shop and get some more bacon. I think we're almost out." Heather laughed. "Why am I not surprised you want more food?" Patrick shrugged, grinning at her. "I think you're the bride I was hoping to get when I wrote that ridiculous letter to the matchmaker. My ma stood over me telling me what to write, and I thought I was going to have to strangle her to get her to mind her own business. I can just picture that. I do like your mother, Patrick. We're working together well while you're working every day." "I'm pleased to hear that." He shook his head. "You never know how someone is going to take my ma. She just never stops talking and saying inappropriate things. I'm so happy you can look past that to her good qualities." "I can. But I do like it when we're able to do something on our own. She keeps asking me if you're a gentle lover." "Oh, pickle juice. She just can't keep her nose out of our business. Maybe it's time for me to build her a little house near ours, but where she's not living with us." Heather laughed, shaking her head. "It's all right. She's not hurting anything." "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm positive. After spending my entire life with my mother, I think she's a delightful change." "All right," he said, staring straight ahead. "What did you tell her about me being a gentle lover?" "I believe I let that question go unanswered," Heather said, shaking her head. "Maybe next time she asks, you tell her a story about us making love. Doesn't have to be true. She might stop asking personal questions. My only worry would be she would take that as an invitation to ask even more questions I don't want to answer." Patrick nodded. I think you're right. She'd want to know way too much that I'm just not willing for her to know. Yes. Heather laughed softly. Some things are better kept between you and me. He pointed out different things along the way. If we had a whole day, I'd drive you up to the overlook on the other side of the lake where you can see for miles and miles. There's no way we could make it there and all the way back for supper, though. That's all right. We have our entire lives to see it. At her words, Patrick put his arm around her shoulders. I like the idea of spending my whole life with you. I'm not sure I'm supposed to feel so strongly about my mail-order bride so soon, but I do. Heather snuggled closer to him as they drove. Thankfully, they'd already driven through Clover Creek on their way to the lake, and there were few other wagons out on the road. When they finally reached the lake, Heather sat spellbound. She'd never left the area around Beckham before. I always wanted to see the ocean, but there was never an opportunity to go. But this lake, it's so beautiful. I want to just sit here and stare at it all day. It makes me wish I had the ability to paint, but I know I'd never be able to do it justice. He nodded. I think the same thing every time I look at it. The lake, surrounded by the mountains, it's this perfect little valley we live in. I cannot imagine ever living anywhere else, so I hope you grow to love it as I do. I'm already getting there. I'm surprised at just how genuinely kind all the people seem to be. She shook her head. And there is a doctor here. I won't have to worry when the time comes for me to give your mother a grandchild. He chuckled. I notice you're not having a baby. You're giving my mother a grandchild. She grinned at him. I knew you'd understand what I meant. On the drive home, they chatted about different things they wanted in their lives. They both wanted many children, and they both wanted the ranch to be successful. Do you want to do anything besides be a mother and take care of the house? He asked, not wanting to act as if her aspirations weren't real as well. No, it's all I've ever wanted. I've been a caregiver for my mother for a very long time. I like the idea of doing that for people who will eventually be able to do things on their own. Heather hoped she didn't sound cold and unreasonable. There was no way to describe all that she'd gone through and done for her mother. I can understand that. There's a good school in Clover Creek as well. It wasn't too far for me to walk there when I was a boy. I'm sure the children will love it. And you're able to keep school teachers? She asked. Yes, of course. Why wouldn't we be able to? There's always someone wanting to teach. She laughed. We went through new teachers all the time. I went to a country school with a family with a lot of kids, and they were always pulling pranks on the teachers. It got to the point the district would only hire men for the position because women were run out too quickly. He shook his head. That's terrible. It is. We called the kids in that family the demon horde. Their older sister is the matchmaker who sent me here. Our school isn't like that at all. Most of the teachers are from one family and have been for years. The children are mostly well behaved, and if there's trouble at school, the parents deal with the children. That was the real problem with the demon horde, she said. The parents just wouldn't deal with their children. I think that's just terrible, he said. When they got back to the house, she took him upstairs and had him help her hang the curtains. I can't reach that high and would have to stand on a chair. You can do it without shoes on. It only makes sense for you to do it. Patrick chuckled. I should have asked for a wife who was too big to fit in my pocket. She laughed. I don't think you want anyone else, but feel free to tell me if I'm wrong. Heather moved close to him and pulled his head down for a kiss. Oh, you're not wrong. His grin made her feel all warm inside. Sally called from downstairs. If you two are done canoodling up there, I think you should come down and eat supper. Patrick laughed, resting his forehead against hers. I think maybe I should send my ma to stay with someone. You know anyone needing a ma back east? I don't. They went downstairs to find that Sally had cooked her usual mountain of food. I would have helped with the cooking, Heather told Sally. I know. I thought you two needed a little break in the middle of the day too, well, you know. Sally winked at them. Patrick shook his head and went to the table, while Heather quickly helped carry the food into the dining room. I promise, you'll get those grandbabies, but I think we'll have to stop trying to make them if you keep talking about them, Heather said. Now you wouldn't do that to me. You know I'm living only to hold my sweet grandbaby in my arms. Sally studied Heather for a moment. I hope you can make milk. Heather just smiled. I'm sure I can. After supper, Heather sat down and wrote a letter to her mother. Dear Mother, I'm married and doing well. I was a mail-order bride to a wonderful man in the new state of Idaho. I'm quite happy here, and I live with him and my new mother-in-law, Sally. I hope you are getting out and seeing people as well as taking care of everything you need to do around the house. I know you're capable, but I also know you needed a push to do it. I do miss you, but I love my new life, and I pray that Patrick and I will have a child soon. I've enclosed our address if you would like to start a correspondence. I would dearly love to let you know what is happening in my life from time to time. I've never wanted a life that you weren't a part of. Love. Heather. She read over the letter once more before sealing it and setting it aside to go to the mercantile in town the following day. We're going to town tomorrow, Heather said to Sally. Patrick thinks we need more bacon. We always need more bacon. It's part of being the people who cook for a strong man like Patrick. Sally smiled at her son. Don't worry, I'll keep cooking for you. I wasn't worried, Patrick said with a smile at his mother. I think I'm going to go and look at my garden, Sally said. I need to see what work Heather and I will need to do with it this week. Heather smiled. I love having a kitchen garden, where I can plant whatever I want and harvest all summer long. Canning together will be fun this year. Sally nodded, putting her hand on Heather's shoulder on her way out of the room. I do appreciate the extra set of hands helping me every day. Of course, I'll appreciate the babies even more. As soon as she was out of the house, she looked at Patrick, who was reading the time machine. She's never going to quit, is she? He raised an eyebrow. You thought otherwise? I did. I don't know why I did, but I did. I guess I just didn't realize how determined she is to throw propriety out the window and talk of things that shouldn't be spoken of. Heather sighed. I like her, but I do hope she stops soon. Maybe once she has a grandbaby, she'll let us carry on making the others as we want to. He chuckled. I'm surprised she isn't already tracking your cycles, so she'll be the first to know when we are expecting. Are you sure she's not? I have no idea. I hope not though. I want to be the first to know. I'll do my best to make that happen. Heather reached across the table for his hand, and immediately felt safe when he engulfed her hand. Being with such a large man was frightening in some ways, but in others, it felt right and perfect. Patrick was a good man, and she knew she'd done well when she'd agreed to marry him. The following morning after breakfast, Heather drove into town on her own to get bacon, white thread, and to mail her letter. She was certain to hear from her mother quickly, but she didn't let it bother her that the letter wouldn't be kind. No, she had done what she felt the need to do, and she would have to deal with the consequences. She still hadn't told Sally that her mother was alive, and she didn't plan to unless it became necessary. She dropped the letter with Amos Jensen, chose the thread she needed, and purchased 20 pounds of bacon. Amos frowned at her. Are you sure that's enough? Mrs. O'Brien purchases at least 50, but usually 100. Heather laughed, shaking her head. Let me get 100 pounds of bacon then. Your Patrick can out-eat any man in this town. We were friends back when we were in school together. I would try to out-eat him at lunch every day, and he never knew it was a contest, but he would eat 6 sandwiches, and I'd only have 2. My ma never thought it was necessary for me to pack such a huge amount of food for my lunch. I'm not even a little bit surprised, Mr. Jensen. Patrick seems to eat his weight in food every single meal. At least I know that the way to keep him happy is just to keep making more food. Amos laughed. I hope you make good pies. Patrick was always looking for pie at the bottom of his lunch pail. Would it be there? Most days it would. Mrs. O'Brien certainly liked to keep him happy. Chapter 8. Heather and Patrick had been married for a month when a wagon pulled into their yard. Patrick was out working, so Heather and Sally stepped outside to see who was there, as they weren't expecting any visitors. Heather didn't know the man driving the wagon, which wasn't all too surprising as she'd not yet met everyone in town. But as she watched, her mother climbed down from the wagon and reached in the back for 2 carpet bags. Heather stood frozen in horror for a moment, but her mother was all smiles as she climbed the front steps to embrace her daughter. I've missed you so much, baby. I'm so thankful you sent me a letter with your location so I could come stay with you. At her mother's words, Heather's heart sank. I think you should probably stay at the boarding house in town, she said softly. Are you saying your own mother isn't welcome in your home? Mother asked, her voice carrying not only to Sally but to the man who had driven the wagon. Heather looked at Sally, her face imploring the older woman to tell her mother to leave. Instead, Sally stepped forward and offered her hand. I'm Sally O'Brien, Heather's new mother-in-law. Caroline Flower. I'm Heather's mother. Sally looked at Heather with confusion for a moment before reaching a hand out to shake Caroline's. It's nice to meet you. You did a wonderful job raising your daughter. Caroline looked proud. Thank you. I believe so myself. Heather wanted to contradict her mother and say she'd been raised by her father with much help from her paternal grandmother, but she didn't. It would be rude to say something like that. Come in. We're making lunch right now. Do you like bacon sandwiches? Sally asked, leading Caroline into the house. I do. My daughter wouldn't make them for me before she left to marry your son. She was getting very bossy right before she came here. Perhaps because she knew she would soon be leaving. Heather didn't respond. There was no point. Her mother would simply continue to talk about her as if she was a bad person, and she knew Sally would soon hate her. Heather went back to cutting the bread into thin slices for their sandwiches, while Sally returned to making the bacon. Sally kept giving Heather strange looks, but Heather had no idea what to say to her mother-in-law. How was the trip out here? Sally asked Caroline. Very bumpy. I'd never been on a train before, but I find that it's not quite what I expected. I suppose I thought it was all sleeping cars and comfort, but truly, it's a ghastly way to travel. Caroline shook her head. But I knew it was the fastest way to get to my little girl. Heather's hands were shaking as she carefully cut the bread. She couldn't understand anything happening around her. Just a month before, her mother had told her she had a month or 2 to live, and now she was in Clover Creek. After cutting the bread, Heather set the table for 4. Then she carried all the bread into the dining room. Caroline looked at all the bread. Do you think you're feeding an army? That's way too much food for us. My husband comes in for lunch most days. Oh, I look forward to meeting him. Patrick, I believe you said in your letter? At Heather's nod, Caroline smiled. Oh, I can't wait to meet the man who took you away from me. When Patrick walked into the house, he stopped, staring at Caroline. Who are you? He asked. He knew it was rude, but he wasn't used to people he didn't know being in his home. I'm Caroline, your new mother-in-law. She stood up to look at him, and she seemed to slink back away from him. You're a rather large man. Patrick shrugged. I hadn't noticed. His mind was spinning with all Heather had told him about her mother, and he had no idea what to do with the information. "Are you visiting for a while?" Caroline nodded. "Oh, yes. I sold my farm and came to Heather. I knew she'd need me by her side." Patrick looked between Caroline and Heather, and for his wife's comfort, he said, "I'll take you to the boarding house in town after supper. I'm sure they'll have room for you, and you'll be able to meet some of the townsfolk." Caroline gasped. "Are you saying that I can't stay here?" "I believe you'll be more comfortable at the boarding house in town." Sally seemed confused when she came in with 2 plates of bacon, both piled high. "She's going to the boarding house? That Mrs. Pruitt runs?" Patrick nodded. "I believe that would be best." Sally still looked confused, but she nodded her agreement. "After supper then. Would you like to help Heather and I put up blackberry jam today? We've been harvesting the berries for 2 days, and it's time to turn them into something to see us through the winter." Caroline smiled. "Oh, I would adore that. I do love making jam." Heather gaped at her mother, whom she had never seen do something as mundane as making jam. No, her mother was more the type to sit in the opposite corner of the kitchen while Heather and her grandmother did the work themselves. She had no idea what kind of game her mother was playing, but it was already starting to upset her. "Oh, good," Sally said. "It'll be a canning party." "My favorite kind," Caroline said. Heather was done listening and being surprised by what her mother was saying. It was time to eat, and she plopped her bottom onto a chair at the table. Patrick offered the prayer, and afterward, he started to put his own sandwiches together, planning to sit silently and learn as much about Caroline as he could. Heather picked at her food, only eating 1 sandwich, and it felt like lead in her stomach. Caroline talked about how much she enjoyed cooking and taking care of her home. "I taught my Heather everything I know." Heather didn't respond, but she could feel Patrick's eyes on her. Did he believe her mother and that she was a liar? Or did he believe the stories she'd told him about how her mother had acted when she was pretending to be ill? As soon as the meal was over, Heather began clearing the table while Patrick went back to work for the afternoon. Once the kitchen was clean, she waited on Sally to give her directions as to her job in the process of jam making. Sally had certain ways she liked to do things, and Heather was always happy to comply. Her mother stood back and watched, but then, she jumped into the middle. "Heather, why aren't you washing these berries and getting the stems out?" "Sally, I'm so sorry. I raised my daughter to be more helpful around the house." Caroline began washing the jars they would use, while Sally gathered everything they would need for making the jam. "I just love blackberry jam," Caroline said. Heather kept at her task, sorting out the bad pieces from the blackberries. She wanted to start mumbling under her breath, but she was able to resist. Sally smiled at Caroline. "You did a great job on the jars. I can see you must have done a lot of canning. Don't you just love harvest time?" "It's always been my favorite time of year," Caroline said, a big smile on her face. "Heather and I would always do the harvesting together, and then we'd put up whatever we could. Some of my favorite memories are Heather and I working hard together to make sure the food was going to stay good for the winter." Heather knew her mother had never once helped with any kind of harvest or canning. She had no idea what her mother was doing there with all her lies, but she wanted to find out. "It's so nice you two have those memories together. I lost my only daughter when she was a few days old, and I would have loved to have shared memories like that with her." Heather counted to 10 under her breath, carefully going on with her task. By the time Patrick was home that evening, they'd put up 25 jars of blackberry jam. "I think this is the best batch I've ever made," Sally said with a smile. "I'll have to make sure to take a couple of jars to Pastor Scott. He does love jam, and his wife is getting too old to be able to do her share of canning." "Their children don't help?" Heather asked, surprised. Sally nodded. Each of their children gives them part of their harvest. They end up with jars and jars of food in their cellar by the end of October every year. What I love about it, though, is that the pastor always tells me my blackberry jam is his favorite. So, I keep taking him some every year. Heather smiled. I think that's very sweet. Pastor Scott and Mrs. Scott seem like such good people. You should hear the stories Hannah Scott tells of her trip on the Oregon Trail. It's amazing what she went through to become the pastor's wife for this little town. Sally pulled a roast from the oven and set it on a hot pad on the table at the back of the kitchen. Patrick popped his head into the kitchen, frowning when he saw that Caroline was still there. No food? He asked. The roast is done, but we need to make the potatoes yet, Heather said. Or we could just make a gravy and have roast beef sandwiches with gravy. Patrick nodded. That's faster? Yes, it is. Heather felt badly his food wasn't ready. Then let's do that. Heather immediately skimmed some of the drippings from the pot roasts they'd made and filled a jar they hadn't used. Then she went to the stove and made the gravy, adding in the drippings. It was how her grandmother had taught her to make gravy when she was just a girl, and she found that Patrick loved her gravy. As soon as it was done, she filled a bowl with the hot gravy and moved the meat onto a platter, while Sally and her mother continued to take the jars of jam into the cellar for later use. Patrick kept watching her with an odd look on his face, as if he was trying to figure out what was really happening with her mother there. She quickly set the table and then sat down at Patrick's side, whispering as fast as she could. I don't know why she's here. And she's pretending to be someone who cooks and cleans. I've never seen her do either of those things. She made us eggs for every meal, because it was all she knew how to make. I've been cooking for my family since I was 10. Patrick nodded, though he seemed confused. But why did she come all this way then? What good does it do her? I have no idea. But the person who has been helping us make jam all day is not my mother. It looks like her, but it can't be. Heather felt as if she had to explain everything all at once. I know it looks as if I lied to you, but I didn't. Mother was pretending to be on her deathbed when I left Beckham. Her mother and Sally walked into the dining room then, each of them taking a seat at the table. I had so much fun helping put the jam up today, Caroline said. What can I help with tomorrow? Sally smiled. Tomorrow we're going to be harvesting potatoes all day. It's the hardest part of our harvest because we must dig for them, but it's so worth it. You're welcome to come and help. That sounds lovely. Anything I can do to help you and spend time with my daughter. When Patrick said the prayer, Heather added her own prayer that her mother would stop lying. She was afraid there would be marital problems if her mother didn't own up to the truth. While they ate, Caroline told a story about picking strawberries with Heather one spring. As Heather listened, she realized that her mother was telling a story of her picking strawberries with her grandmother. And then we spent a whole day making jam and canning it for the winter. I think Heather asked for jam on her toast every morning that whole year. Caroline smiled at her daughter lovingly. Heather didn't contradict her, though she had to wonder why her mother replaced her grandmother in her stories. It seemed as if there may be something wrong with her mother after all, but it wasn't physical. No, her mother was losing her mind. As soon as they were finished eating, Heather cleared the table while Sally boiled the water to do dishes. Patrick looked at Caroline. I'll take you to the boarding house. There's one for ladies and one for men. I'd appreciate that. I'm excited to get to know people in your little town. He nodded before going out to hitch up the wagon. He handed his mother-in-law into the seat before walking around and taking the leads. How are you and Heather getting on? Her mother asked. She seems afraid of you. Patrick frowned. Heather is not afraid of me. We get along very well. It's like we chose one another, and she didn't come to me as a mail-order bride. I see. She told me that she was shocked when she saw how big you are, and you're careless with her in bed. Is that true? Caroline asked. I will not discuss those things with you. Patrick was hurt that Heather would say such a thing, and he prayed her mother was trying to stir up trouble, as Heather had told him earlier. Once they were in town, he pulled up in front of the Pruitts' boarding house and helped her down. He walked her inside himself and introduced her to Amanda Bedwell. Amanda, this is my mother-in-law. She'd like to have a room for a while. Amanda nodded. We don't allow men visitors here, she said emphatically. We serve 3 meals per day, and you do your own washing. For extra money, we will clean your room for you. She named a figure. That's our weekly rate. Caroline smiled and pulled some money from her reticule. This should be enough for a month then. Amanda counted out the money and gave Caroline her change. We'll take good care of her, Mr. O'Brien. Thank you, Patrick said, heading for the door. Now to go home and figure out what his wife was hiding from him. Chapter 9. After her mother had left for the evening, Sally looked at Heather. I thought your mother was dead. Heather shook her head. I never actually said that. You assumed it, and I let you. She sighed. Let's go in the parlor, and I'll talk. I will tell you that Patrick knew the whole story, but I didn't want you to think less of me. Once they were both seated in the parlor, Heather spoke again. My father died when I was young. Mother hired a farmhand to do all the things he'd done, and I finished school. Around the time I finished, Mother said she was sick. She started having the doctor come to see her every day. I had a man who wanted to court me, but I said no, because I needed to care for my sick mother. It went that way for 9 years. I spent my days cooking, cleaning, and doing all the shopping and laundry, while Mother languished in bed, complaining about how badly she felt. Sally's eyes narrowed. That's hard to believe. Heather nodded. I know. About 3 months ago, I walked into the house to see my mother standing beside her bed, stretching. She did toe touches and jumping jacks. She'd told me the week before the doctor said she'd be bedridden soon, and there was no way she would be able to continue walking all the way across the house to the table to eat, and she would prefer if I started bringing her meals to her bed. Shaking her head, she said, I started to question everything at that point. After a few weeks, I decided to catch the doctor alone, and see if she really was sick or just pretending so I would do all the work and take care of her. Sally nodded. That sounds like a perfectly logical way to handle it. The doctor told me there wasn't a thing wrong with my mother. That I was allowing her to be ill by taking care of her. I asked a few more questions and told him I thought I was going to leave town, just to be sure she really could care for herself. Heather hoped with everything inside her that Sally believed her. After their visit, he suggested I meet with Elizabeth Tandy, the matchmaker who Patrick sent his letter to. All right. I went to town under the ruse of shopping, and while I was there, I went to see Mrs. Tandy. I didn't tell her anything about why I was there, as I didn't want people to think poorly of Mother, but I made it clear I needed to leave soon. Elizabeth handed me Patrick's letter, and I wrote a quick response for the Telegraph. I left the following morning. I left Mother a note saying I was leaving and not to try to find me because she wouldn't be able to. Sally looked stunned, but Heather wasn't certain if the older woman believed her. Shortly after I arrived, I was telling Patrick that I'd left a note telling her little other than I was leaving. He convinced me that it would be the right thing to do to send her a letter, telling her that I was safe. I had no idea she'd follow me, so I gave the name of the town so she could at least correspond with me. I never heard back from her, but she showed up here this morning. Sally shook her head. That lovely woman who was here today couldn't be the woman you're talking about. What about all the sweet stories about you picking berries and making jam together? To my knowledge, my mother has never made jam in her life. The stories were about my grandmother and me when we made jam together. Mother just put herself into those stories, so she would seem like the perfect mother. Heather sighed. She told me the night before I left that the doctor had told her she only had 1 or 2 months to live, and I know the doctor said nothing of the kind. My mother died shortly before Patrick was born. All I could think about was that I wished she'd lasted just another month, so she could hold her grandson for the first time. Heather frowned. I'm so sorry for your loss, but my relationship with my mother was never a good one. I took care of her out of duty. I was very angry when I found she'd been lying to me for years, and there was nothing wrong with her. Sally frowned. It's just so hard to reconcile what you're saying with the woman who spent the day helping us in the kitchen. I understand. But I also know what I lived through. I would like for everyone to believe me and realize that my mother is not who she says she is, but I have no idea how to make that happen. I suppose I could write the doctor. Sally frowned. But how would we know if he was the doctor who treated her? You could have anyone write that letter back to you. That's very true. I do hope you'll either believe me or give me a chance to prove I'm the woman I say I am. Mother's truth will come out. She can't keep up the pretense for long. Patrick walked in and shut the door behind him, and both ladies turned where they could see him. Heather, if that woman is your mother, she's nothing like you described her. Have you lied to me, or is she pretending? Heather wanted to hit her own head against the wall and cry. She'd been there for a month, and she'd felt like her relationship with both Patrick and his mother was good, and her mother had ruined everything in less than 24 hours. She's pretending, but I have no proof of that. She got to her feet and headed up the stairs for bed, having no desire to have her honesty put into questions. When she got upstairs, she changed into her nightgown and found her way across the hall to the bedroom there. She sat down on the edge of the bed and prayed to God that something would happen to reveal her mother for who she truly was. It was the only way her marriage would be able to last. When Patrick headed upstairs a short while later, he found that his wife wasn't in his bed where she belonged. He thought about finding her and dragging her back, but he didn't know what good it would do. If she'd been lying to him for the past month, how would it help to force her to sleep with him? He stripped and climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling. Either his wife was a liar, or her mother was an excellent actress. Until he knew for sure, he would be on his guard around both. Asterisk. When Heather woke in the morning, her eyes were gummed shut from crying all night, and she wanted nothing more than to go back to sleep so she wouldn't have to face her day. Instead, she dressed and went downstairs to get breakfast started. Sally was there waiting for her and gave her orders as always. But the whole atmosphere in the kitchen was different. Her mother's lies were ruining her life. Again. As Heather set the table, Patrick came down the stairs and headed straight out to the barn, not even glancing in her direction. Life felt terribly unfair. At breakfast, Sally did all the talking, which wasn't terribly unusual, but the other two didn't even listen. We need to bake at least 10 loaves of bread today, and we'll spend the rest of the day harvesting everything that's ripe. I have 2 pitchforks for us to dig potatoes with, and then we'll pick the potatoes out of the dirt. We need to leave as much dirt on them as we can, because it helps preserve the potatoes through the long winter. Heather played with her food, pushing it around on her plate so it would look like she'd eaten something. How could her life take such a terrible turn in only one day? Her mother wrecked everything without even trying. Patrick seemed exceptionally unhappy, and he only ate 15 pancakes instead of his usual 20. He was as torn up as she was. Heather wanted to reach out to him, but she didn't want to be rejected. They were just finishing up the morning dishes when her mother knocked at the door. She'd gotten a ride from Amos at the mercantile. "I'm here to help with the harvest," she announced when Sally opened the door for her. She said it with a flair, one arm raised above her head. Heather didn't respond. Instead, she finished washing the dishes, while Sally explained how to dig potatoes. When they went outside, Heather wasn't surprised to see her mother pick up the burlap bag to put the potatoes into instead of one of the pitchforks which would be used for digging. The harder task was always the one her mother chose not to do. Tea at the table. I had so much fun helping put the jam up today, Caroline said. What can I help with tomorrow? All morning, Heather and Sally dug up potatoes while her mother picked them up. As Heather watched, her mother began grabbing her back as if it was in a great deal of pain. Heather said nothing. She wasn't going to be the one to start pampering her mother and turn her back into the person she'd been in Beckham. Shortly before noon, Sally wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve. That's all I can do this morning. Now to make lunch for my ever-hungry boy. Heather rested both pitchforks against the stairs that led into the house and left her mother to carry the potatoes in. She didn't know exactly how her mother had escaped learning what hard work was, but it was obvious she had. In the house, Heather and Sally began working together to make lunch. It was just sandwiches again, but Heather knew that Patrick wouldn't complain. They had some ham from 2 nights before, and Heather carefully cut that, while Sally cut the bread into thin slices. When Heather went into the dining room to set the table, her mother was sitting limply at the spot where she'd been sitting since they'd come inside. Heather worked around her as best she could. Finally, she carried the food into the dining room, setting it on the table as well. Sally looked surprised to see Caroline sitting at the table, with a glazed look in her eyes. Heather understood though. Her mother had done no work in almost 10 years. That left her incapable of keeping up with Sally and herself. Patrick came in and said nothing as he sat down to eat. He noted that Caroline was sitting at the table still holding the bag of potatoes, but he said nothing. Instead, he bowed his head and prayed over their meal. He'd eaten so little for breakfast, he was even hungrier than usual. Each of them made their own sandwiches. But Caroline sat still staring straight ahead. Heather ate 2 sandwiches, which was a lot for her, but harvesting potatoes was hard work. Finally, Sally gave Caroline a strange look. Are you hungry? I suppose I am, Caroline said, obviously still not quite able to do much. Do you need me to fix your sandwich for you? Sally asked. Heather closed her eyes, fearing her mother's response. If anyone wanted to wait on Mother, she'd certainly allow it. Caroline nodded. Please. I'll be upstairs lying down. If you could bring them into the bedroom where I choose to nap, it would be appreciated. With those words, Caroline climbed the stairs and disappeared. Heather acted as if nothing had happened as she continued to eat her meal. Sally frowned, but she made 2 sandwiches and carried them up the stairs. Patrick looked at Heather, expecting to see her emphasizing that her mother was expecting to be waited on, but she just continued eating. What are we having for supper? Patrick asked, giving Heather a chance to say something about her mother's behavior, but Heather once again surprised him. I believe your mother said we were making shepherd's pie tonight. I've had it, but I've never fixed it, so I'm excited to learn the receipt. Heather gave him a half-smile, as if she had no idea how he'd react. Sally came downstairs after taking Caroline her food, and she looked at Heather in shock. She said you need to call the doctor. She thinks she's having a relapse. Heather nodded. I'm sure she does. She wasn't about to go fetch the doctor though. There was no point. When Heather finished her meal, she cleared the table with both Patrick and Sally watching her. Aren't you going to get the doctor? Sally asked. Heather shook her head. Trust me. It's best if we just let her stay up there as long as she wants, but don't offer to take her anything. That's what she wants. Sally frowned. What if she's really sick? She's not. She's simply tired because she did some actual work this morning. If we bring in a doctor, she will never leave that room. Sally and Patrick exchanged a look. But if we don't help her, will she die up there? Sally asked. Heather shook her head. She's fit as a fiddle. At least that's what the doctor in Beckham told me before I left. She continued clearing the table as if nothing was wrong at all, pleased that they were seeing some of her mother's theatrics. While Heather and Sally made supper that afternoon, they could hear Caroline calling them from upstairs. At first, she used a voice that made her sound sick. And then her voice grew louder. Finally, it sounded like someone bellowing orders. Sally looked at Heather, who was doing her best to simply ignore everything her mother said. I don't think I can take this much longer. I need to take her a drink of water or something. If you do, you will become a slave to her every whim. She was tired after picking up potatoes all morning, but only because she hadn't done anything in almost 10 years. I would strongly suggest not going up there, but if you do, know that you go up alone. I will not be party to my mother pretending to be dying ever again. Sally looked at her for a moment, but seeing the resolve on Heather's face, she knew she should follow her daughter-in-law's lead, no matter how hard it was. When Patrick arrived home for the day, Caroline was still yelling sporadically, telling them she needed water, or that someone needed to read her a book. He was very surprised to see his mother not running to help her. She was a born caretaker, and he knew it must be hurting her not to do as the woman asked. The shepherd's pie was delicious, and Heather complimented Sally. I would like this receipt written down, so I don't forget how to make it, she said. This is wonderful. Patrick glanced toward the stairs. Are you sure we shouldn't check on her? Heather took a deep breath. Do you want your mother-in-law living in this house for the rest of her days? She'll expect to be fed 3 meals a day in bed. I could only talk her into going to the table in Beckham because there were no stairs. Patrick looked toward the stairs one more time and shrugged. Heather knew her better than he did. Chapter 10. After the supper dishes were done, Patrick asked Heather if she'd walk with him for a while. Heather nodded, happy to get out of the house where her mother was still yelling from the upstairs. Are we going to be able to get her out of the house tonight? Patrick asked as he looked up at the house from outside. I don't know if we'll get her out tonight, but soon. No one will cook for her or take food upstairs for her, so she'll eventually get hungry and come down to find something to eat. I'll have to talk to your mother about hiding any food that's ready to eat. The bread we made today and any desserts. We'll need to keep them so Mother can't find them. She won't cook for herself. She'll go home to the boarding house. Is there a way we can send her back to Massachusetts? Heather shook her head. I really don't think so. It would be nice, but she sold the farm. There's nothing there for her to go back to. He sighed. I guess you're right. But does that mean she has to stay here for the rest of her life? Oh, no. I'm not living with her. She can stay at the boarding house, and we can see her at church on Sundays. I don't think we need to let her keep coming here and acting this way. Heather knew she sounded cold-hearted, but she also knew that both Patrick and Sally were starting to understand that what she'd said about her mother was true. Do you think she'll let me take her to the boarding house tonight? He asked. She shrugged. I never know what she's going to do. I doubt if she'll let us get her out of the house tonight. She had not stepped foot out of the house in Massachusetts for 10 years. She had a chamber pot that I needed to empty for her. He groaned. How are you able to be such a good, sensible person when you came from her? She smiled a little. I had a wonderful father and an even more wonderful grandmother. She taught me all I know about cooking and cleaning. Mother taught me nothing. I've been cooking for my family since I was 10. I can't believe I trusted her even for a moment. I'm so sorry, Heather. I know you, and I know you aren't a terrible person. I should have listened to you and believed everything you said to me. Heather stopped walking and turned to him. My feelings were very hurt. I thought she'd managed to ruin everything we'd built here in just a day. But now that she's shown her true colors, it's much easier to believe me. She shook her head. I wish you'd believed me when she first arrived, instead of falling for her act. If you don't trust your wife, how can you have a good marriage? I know I should have believed you. But she did put on a good act. She's good at pretending to be something she's not. Remember, she fooled me for more than 9 years with her invalid act. He cupped her face in his hands, staring down at her. I hope you can forgive me. I shouldn't have questioned you for even a minute. He closed his eyes for a moment, and then blurted out the feelings he'd had for her since the first day they'd met. I love you, Heather. At his words, tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. I love you too. I have since I first arrived, and you couldn't talk to me because your mother had too much to say. Maybe we shouldn't have either of our mothers living with us. They could get a house together, and my mother could take care of your mother. He grinned at her, and she laughed softly. We can't get rid of your mother. She's teaching me so many things. I learned to knit just last week. Mother loves teaching you, he said. She's really happy you came here and not someone else. Or she was until your mother came, but I'm sure she's back to loving you like her own. I probably should have told her all about my mother when I first arrived in Clover Creek. I just didn't want her to think less of me. Patrick nodded. I think you've grown in both of our eyes now. I don't know how or why I ever doubted you. Will you forgive me? Of course I will. If you get rid of my mother soon. Let's go up and talk to her right now. I would love to be able to drive into Clover Creek and leave her there. Nothing would make me happier. Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, passing his mother in the parlor, and went straight up the stairs. As they approached the room where her mother was, Heather straightened her spine. Once in the room, the two of them looked down at her mother, who looked perfectly healthy. Mother, I gave you my location so you would no longer worry about me, and we could correspond. It was not an invitation to come here and pretend to be ill again. I'm not spending the rest of my life taking care of you. I'm married now. My duty is to my husband. I would greatly appreciate it if you would get out of that bed and get yourself downstairs. Patrick is ready to take you back to the boarding house in town. Her mother stared at her for a moment before pouting. But Heather, I am truly ill. I ache everywhere. You ache because it's been over 10 years since you've done any real work. It's normal, and it's called working. Now, please get out of this bed, before I have Patrick throw you over his shoulder and carry you downstairs and deposit you in the back of the wagon. You wouldn't. Mother said, looking very offended at the prospect. Patrick leaned over and grabbed his mother-in-law by the waist and threw her over his shoulder. Would you get the door for me, love? Heather hurried and opened the bedroom door, and then she rushed down the stairs so she could open the front door. Sally barely looked up from the booties she was knitting. She did call out, "Goodbye, Caroline." Dumping Heather's mother into the back of the wagon he'd hitched before supper, he looked at his wife. Would you like to ride along with me? Certainly. That would be lovely. Once she was in the wagon seat with him, he smiled at her. I'm glad you're going for a ride with me. The kicking and screaming from the back of the wagon had reached a volume that was truly offensive. Mother, you need to be quiet. You don't want the whole town to know what a terrible person you are, do you? Her mother quieted after that, but nothing else was said. When they were in front of the boarding house, Patrick asked, Do I need to carry you inside? Or do you think you can find some dignity and make it in on your own? I truly don't mind either way. Caroline huffed, but she got out of the back of the wagon and walked toward the boarding house with her head held high. When she was just about to reach the door, Heather shouted, "Oh, Mother?" When her mother turned to look at her, she had an expression on her face that told Heather she thought all was well between them. Don't come back. Heather turned and looked straight ahead as Patrick drove them just north of town to the ranch where he'd grown up. I'm so glad she's gone. I am as well. He shook his head. I'm just waiting to hear what Ma has to say about it all. We'll find out together, Heather said, jumping down and waiting for him as he unhitched the team and put them in the stable after seeing to their care. He joined her and they walked toward the house together. Inside, they walked to the parlor, and Sally held up a pair of tiny booties. I'm ready for a baby to put these on, Sally said. Heather laughed, shaking her head. Patrick scooped his wife up in his arms. We'll go see what we can do about that, he said. Heather's cheeks were flaming when he put her down on the bed in their room. What were you thinking? She asked. You handled your mother. Let me handle mine. He closed the door behind him and started to remove his clothes. I think I want that baby as much as Ma does. I know I do. A baby that is part me and part you. She smiled. A whole house full of babies that work as hard as their parents to be good people and to make a living. That would be ideal. I don't want any of them to be anything like your mother. Heather nodded. And it would be nice if they weren't as outspoken as your mother. Patrick agreed readily. That would be wonderful. I do hope we can put in a request for children that are just like that. I don't think it works that way, she said. But it doesn't matter either. Our children will be loved and cherished and raised the best way we know how. In a home filled with love, Patrick said, joining her on the bed. So filled with love, there's no room for anything else. Epilogue. 8 months later, Heather stared down into the cradle at the baby she and Patrick had made together. She had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and she was absolutely perfect in every way. They had decided to call her Thelma Louise, and during her first week of life, she'd been a precious little angel. Patrick walked up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. She just gets more beautiful every day. Are you sure you don't mind that we had a girl first? Not that there's anything we can do about it. I'm sure. I think our Thelma is the most beautiful child to ever live. Patrick sighed contentedly. And Ma said that your hips are just fine to birth as many babies as we want to have. Heather smiled, turning to wrap him in her arms. I think I'm going to invite my mother over to meet her. He raised an eyebrow. Are you certain that's a good idea? I think so. I've had nothing to do with her other than church for all this time. Perhaps meeting her granddaughter will turn her around. And if it doesn't? Heather shrugged. Then we go back to the way things were. Are you up for carrying her out of the house again? I think I enjoyed that a great deal more than I should have. She giggled, burying her face in his chest. I can't wait to show her off. I'm assuming you mean Thelma, and not your mother? Of course. Who would show my mother off? Invite your mother to meet her. Let her know I'll pick her up from the boarding house at 6 and will return her by 8. She gets 2 hours and that's all. Heather nodded. I think that's best. Do we warn your mother? He chuckled. Let's surprise her.